member of Middle East Committee of Women Against Military Madness, or WAM. I'm also involved with the Minnesota BDS community, which participates with the international campaign to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel for the purpose of pressing for changes in policies and actions that violate the human rights of Palestinian people. The BDS community invites all of you who live in Minnesota to contact your state legislators this week, encouraging them to, in the coming week, encouraging them to support two bills that have just been introduced, Senate File 1039 and House File 1246. These bills would repeal two statutes that were passed in 2017 that we understand to be in violation of the First Amendment rights of Minnesotans to engage in boycotts. Really, those are anti-BDS statutes, but the vague language in the statutes refers to discrimination, in quotes, air quotes here, discrimination against Israel. More details are available on the Middle East Peace Now and WAM Facebook pages. Urge your legislators to attend an information session that is coming up. They'll be invited to it the morning of Friday, March 5th. And so you can take action this week regarding this issue. Our guest today, Dr. Mazin Qumsiyeh, certainly understands the pressures at play around the world that affect the lives of Palestinians. His perspective, though, is amazing in its breadth and depth. He is a scientist. Who else could write books about bats of Egypt and mammals of the Holy Land? Professor Qumsiyeh has taught at Yale in the United States and most recently at Bethlehem and Birzeit universities. His range of interest and expertise encompasses more than human and civil rights. Today, he will bring together the crises of war, climate change, and pandemics from his unique perspective. But rather than continuing to talk about him, I invite Mazin to speak for himself. Thank you, Mazin, and please proceed.
Thank you. I will share my screen and show a few slides, and then we'll proceed. Okay, I hope everybody can see now my screen. So what I will do is very briefly kind of tell you, based on the ideas that you asked me to speak about, how we human beings can work together to achieve peace, sustainable communities in light of threats like climate change, like pandemics and wars and conflict. I do want to thank WAM and Middle East Peace Now and Jewish Voice for Peace for putting this together. It's very important that we all, work together. After all, this one planet that we share is a very small planet. You are over there in the Western Hemisphere now. I'm in the Eastern Hemisphere, if you like. This is the Fertile Crescent, where humans first developed agriculture, where we first domesticated plants and animals. It's a pivotal area because it's also where humans migrated out of Africa to the rest of the world, including the Americas. And still today, birds migrate in and out of Africa through this small bottleneck called Palestine, if you want. Of course, we have a political situation, and conflict and war has been going on for about 120 years now here. And these started in the late 19th century with Western European powers basically trying to meddle and create situations that benefit them. This culminated in the Sykes-Picot Agreement 1916 and the Balfour and Cambon declarations of 1917, respectively from the British and the French governments. But for us, for the native people in this country, the effect of this has been devastating, including 530 Palestinian villages and towns that were depopulated. You can see them on the map on the left. And today, basically, of the 13 million Palestinians in the world, 7.5 million of us are refugees or displaced people. Shrinking of the land of Palestine is analogous to the shrinking of the land of Native Americans when the Europeans, quote unquote, discovered it. And we all ended up in Bantustans, if you want, and we all face the same issues. It's also happened in just about every country on earth. In South Africa, most recently, of course, the apartheid regime tried to relegate the native Black people into Bantustans on about 11.5% of the land of South Africa. In our case, it is on about 8.3% of the land of Palestine that we Palestinians, or at least the remaining Palestinians, are allowed to live. This is what's called settler colonialism, and it's one of many human ills, if you want. And now, perhaps there's a genetic predisposition to settler colonialism, because now we're talking about colonizing Mars and things like that. The impact on the environment and on the people is devastating. I don't have too much time, and I don't really want to spend too much time describing the symptoms of this. I just want to cite a couple of examples. One of them is the diversion of the water of the Jordan Valley from the upper parts from Lake Tiberias to the west, that dried up the Jordan Valley and the Dead Sea. And now they have a canal that they have built between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea. This canal is going to pump water up, of course, and then as it goes down, there's desalination plants, hydroelectric power plants, and then the sludge that remains is dumped into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is basically a lake in between Palestine and Jordan. Other symptoms include like unequal distribution of resources or theft of resources, if you want to be more accurate about it. Palestine's water has been stolen, and most of it is going to benefit the Israeli colonial settlers. And so we have very little water left for the Palestinians. This is true of other natural resources, but it is true of everything in our life, basically. Everything here is dominated, controlled by the state of Israel, which was built on top of Palestine, on the ruins of these Palestinian villages. And it's hard to describe how pervasive this colonization is. It affects every aspect of our life, from freedom of movement, freedom of religion, practice religion, freedom of education, students coming to our universities, etc. In every aspect, Israel controls us, Perhaps the only thing I could say is that air is yet not controlled, so we can still breathe, but maybe soon they will have to charge us for breathing air. The resultant situation has been devastating for the local Palestinians, but it's also, as I mentioned, devastating for nature. This is, for example, an Israeli settlement built on a hill here. Part of it is land that belongs to my relatives that was taken to build this Jewish-only Israeli colony called Har Homa. And this resulted in the decline of the vertebrate biodiversity in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is the birthplace of Jesus. As you know, my village is just down the road here. It's called Beit Sahur. It's a shepherd's field where the shepherds heard the angels sing according to Christian traditions, went up to Bethlehem where Jesus was born. Of course, our niche in the world is devastated, but there are devastations around the world, and I don't want to, in any way make us somehow unique. There is a lot of destruction of our planet, as you are very well familiar with. 40% of coral reef systems and forests, 40% have disappeared. In decades, there will be more plastic in the oceans than there are fish. 75% of agricultural plant biodiversity lost already. Amazons and Australian forests, you have heard, were on fire just a couple of months ago, a few months ago, are still on fire in the Amazon. We have also the nuclear weapons and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction that are pretty devastating and could end life on Earth as we know it. And we can talk about that. There's a climate change, of course, which is, you're all familiar with it. It's actually greenhouse emissions are highest from the developed countries, industrial economies like the US, Canada, Australia, etc. But the impacts of climate change, as you see on this NASA map, is mostly in our part of the world, like the Arab world, from the Gulf to Morocco, basically are going to be devastated as a result of climate change. Here in Palestine and Jordan, we have had already increase in temperatures and decrease in annual rainfall, but we expect the situation to get much, much worse in the coming 2 decades. Forests have been decimated around the world. This is just a map of both temperate and tropical rainforests that have been destroyed and what's left of them basically in batches, and kind of reminds us of the Bantustans left for the Palestinians, that we have the ghettos left for the trees, if you want. Now, in our situation, we also have these pandemics, as you know, and pandemics are also related to climate change and human activities. I don't know how much you want to know about this or care to know about this, but the reason, for example, we do have pandemics is because of zoonotics, viruses jumping from wild animals to humans because of the close contact and because humans are relying more on wild animals for food and things like that. But also the impact of these pandemics are certainly related to human activities. For example, if you look at just a random example, if I take Italy, North Italy had more fatalities per 100,000 people from the virus than South Italy. Why is that? Because North Italy is more polluted than South Italy. So that's the reason they get more fatalities, because their immune system is weak and cannot resist this virus. The virus showed up in Palestine on March 4th. Here in Bethlehem, actually, it started here from a few tourists, and there was a few cases, and we had lockdowns, and then we had the second wave, and we had the third wave, and a fourth wave, and now we are in the midst of a fifth wave, as you see in this on this figure from Worldometer. We are really in bad shape here in Palestine as far as the virus is concerned. My own village of Beit Sahur, the population is about 13,000. About 25% of them are infected already or recovered, or some of them died, including relatives of mine, two of my aunts, cousins, etc., who have died as a result of this coronavirus. It's not pretty. The picture is not pretty. The hospitals are full. There are story after story of people being turned down from entering hospitals and going home and dying at home because of this. Israel touts itself as medically advanced. That's because they have a lot of money that comes from your taxes and mine, of course, billions and billions of dollars that go to Israel. And so they can buy vaccines and things like that, and they do have advanced medical facilities. But these medical facilities are medical apartheid, just like there is apartheid in other areas. So Israel, between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, controls 12 million people, half of them Israelis, half of them Palestinians. Of the Palestinian population, 1.5 million have Israeli citizenship. Those are remnants from the 1948 ethnic cleansing. And those are able to get the vaccine. But about 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli control do not have access to vaccines. And so we really have a problem here. And you know, according to Geneva Conventions, of course, Israel is in charge of the population under its control, and they should provide us with health care. But this is one of the most profitable occupation in history, not even costly to Israel, but profitable. Over 12 to $13 billion every year Israel gets out of the Palestinians, because we're captive economy and other things. Probably depressed you enough, so I should switch gear. You know, I like this picture, and I kind of put it there because it is inspiring when Native people win something or get something against big corporations like in the Amazon or something like that. So we need to talk about what can be done and what should be done and things like that. And this is the second half of what I want to talk about. We have an institute here that we started called Palestine Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability. The Palestine sunbird is the national bird, and the iris, Nablus iris, is a Palestinian national flower. So we put them on the motto of the museum, or the emblem of the museum, if you want. Our vision is sustainable human and natural communities. This is the facilities that we have kind of took over management of and starting to work on. Starting in 2014, we started to work on this site and grow things in it and develop it. And we have solar panels, we have greenhouses. This is just some of the images from this facility. It is actually a sanctuary in Bethlehem for people and wildlife. These are just some of the wildlife that are inside the compound of about 4 acres is what we have. We have some plants like you know, rare orchids and irises and so forth. We have a community garden where children can grow their own vegetables, etc. We have a pool that collects rainwater, and we have honeybees. We have aquaponic systems, which are systems that allow you to grow both fish and vegetables in the same unit, saving you know, water and saving land. Under the greenhouse, there's very little evaporation, so it's good for that. And we brought some engineers from Gaza where we showed them how to build these systems, and they're already doing them in Gaza and other places. The garden also works as an educational garden for the people. Children especially enjoy coming here. We have a playground and the community garden. The playground is an exploration playground where they learn also about things like composting, as you see in the picture on the upper right-hand corner. But we don't just expect people to come to this institute here to learn things. We actually go to them. And this is going, summer, for example, Shaheen is going working with the farmers and teaching them about permaculture, increasing their food production. I like the term food sovereignty rather than food security, if you want. To be more in charge of our activities. We also work with women initiatives in the villages and the remote villages, especially impacted by the Israeli wall, to try and show them on things like pickling and making raisins and things like that. We work with the children on recycling, as you see here, trash and other things, paper, etc. We always focus on the young people and what their needs are. This is actually Muhammad Najaja, who's a project manager with a group of kids from a high school in the valley here, where we are also working with 80 farmers, half of them women, and and also with these women cooperatives. We bring people to the museum to learn about animals, etc. We believe in learning by doing things, as you see here, learning about insects and lifestyle of insects. And this for us is very important. These two pictures, this one and the one after, are actually from the day before, from yesterday. We have every Friday groups of children come here to explore, to learn about things, to do things. Our team is diversified, young people, men and women who do various things. We have molecular labs also that we managed to develop here at incredible odds to do various things like environmental DNA monitoring and things like that. Our work has been very well recognized and respected around the world and locally. Locally, for example, we set up a biodiversity center, as you see in the sign there. It's funded by the EU, but this is from a signing of an agreement between Bethlehem University and the Environment Quality Authority, where we were tasked with basically doing the 6th national report for the Convention on Biological Diversity, and to build the strategy, the biodiversity strategy for the state of Palestine. We also have this initiative called Palestine Action for the Planet. And this is an initiative that is working for issues like climate change, etc., to recycle, to reduce waste, refuse to use plastics, things like that. I wanted to go through this presentation fairly quickly because I do want to make some comments here at the end where I see our role is and where I see the world heading, basically. So I'll stop the presentation for now, but this is our website if you want to reach us, palestinenature.org. So you can email me also at that email, info@palestinenature.org, and I'll also write this in the chat room in a minute. But I do want to now just kind of summarize and give a few pointers. When I came back from the US in 2008, I was involved in a lot of resistance, civil disobedience, things like that, also in building institutions. And these are tasks and activities that are, in my humble opinion, are complementary. You have to be able to survive as if you can end the occupation. And then you have to challenge the occupation and the violence and the inequality in the world, the greed that leads to war, the rampant capitalism, consumerism that all our societies are afflicted with. As you heard, I taught at the universities in the US, like Tennessee, Duke, and Yale, university, and I kind of lived in the US for a long time. I'm a US citizen. What I see, the trends that are happening in the world are not sustainable. And I think you would agree with me that we cannot continue business as usual in the world. There's finite natural resources which are consuming at ever accelerating pace. We're pumping a lot of gases in the atmosphere. We have a lot of pollution. Nature is not around us anymore. Most people are now living in cities, urbanization, not in the countryside. This reduces the immune response abilities of their bodies, and it makes their lives not healthy. It makes them susceptible to psychological and other disorders that are not really, because we humans are not built for that. We humans are built to live close to nature, to live within nature, in the environment, eating healthy foods, not eating all these foods that are treated with insecticides and pesticides. Anyway, this history, since industrial revolution basically, has caused humans to live unhealthy lives, and for them to be susceptible to the maladies of this modern capitalist era that we live in, ranging from wars, conflict, climate change, pandemics, etc. What can we do as humans? We have these two roads. We can either continue down the road we were going, as a species I'm talking about, which becomes like the lemmings heading off the cliff, basically. They may not be salvageable. Or we can choose another way. The other way is, I think, very obvious to you. It's a way of community. It's a way of having community gardens, community living, living close to nature, not using chemicals, pesticides, insecticides, not using plastics, not reducing fossil fuel towards eliminating it, using alternative energy, all of these things. This requires a revolution. It cannot happen with a few individual actions here and there. It has to have a revolutionary thinking at the level of the species. And I think if we don't do that, we are doomed. As a biologist, as somebody, I got my PhD in biology, and then I got medical genetics training. I would say, from my medical side of the equation, I look at things like what's the symptoms, what's the diagnosis, and then what's the therapies. And the therapies are also becoming more and more obvious to most people. But as a biologist also, I say to myself, okay, what's the chances for this species, my species? And I think the chances are 50-50 maybe 60-40, but that's irrelevant. So what is my role as an individual? And what's your role as individuals? What's our roles as communities, and how can we change this? And I hope the rest of this will be a discussion of these things so that we can act together, thinking globally, but acting locally, of course, is very critical. But we may even need to be thinking about acting globally because, it's all connected. It's not like there's your problems in Minnesota and my problems in Palestine. All these problems are connected. The same greedy people who are destroying our planet are the ones who are here and the ones who are there. They are connected. Mr. Netanyahu's best friend is Modi in India and Trump and all these people. So I think you understand that there's a clique of people that's working against us and against nature, and we have to get our act together. you have, the website now. Somebody posted it in the chat, so you can go to that website if you want to learn more. And, I really appreciate your time and your effort, and I'm happy to discuss because I want to learn from you also and learn from each other so that we can move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. You touched upon this a little bit, but we have a question of what can U.S. citizens do to support the Palestinian struggle for justice and peace?
Well, I mean, I don't want the US citizens to show sympathy or solidarity or give us humanitarian aid or think of it as somehow a solidarity issue. It is the same struggle, as I said, So I want them to think of this issue as part of the symptoms of an ailing planet that we have to challenge it. So on a philosophical level, first of all, I don't want sympathy or, oh, the poor Palestinians, let's help them, or the poor, whatever, Africans, let's help them. I want them to think that there's basically an essential dilemma for the human species that we have to address. Now, why is Palestine an issue that I encourage people to take? It is the same as was with South Africa. Those of you who are my age and whatever, remember the struggle for South Africa in the 1980s. For example, we engaged in boycott, divestment, sanctions for South Africa. Why did we do that? We did it because South Africa was illustrating the Western hypocrisy. Many of our governments, US government, European governments, Canadian, Australian, have always supported apartheid in South Africa. Even though after apartheid ended, they claimed they didn't support it or that they were with the people of South Africa. Their leaders of those countries talked about human rights and talked about international law. Even Biden now talks about human rights and international law. But here he just bombed Syria, for example. That's a violation of international law and a violation of human rights. So, so this hypocrisy of Western governments who are, kind of talk with one, with forked tongues, as we say, was made so obvious in the case of South Africa. And it's made more obvious here in Palestine. Because here in Palestine, basically what is being done is racism that's so blatant. When you have a Jewish state that says it has 65 laws that discriminate against non-Jews within the Jewish state, and it has hundreds of laws called military orders that discriminate against Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, 65 against Israeli citizens who are not Jewish, and hundreds that are against Palestinians who are under its control in the West Bank and Gaza. For example, a military order says I cannot go to Jerusalem simply because my family is Palestinian Christian. So there is this hypocrisy of supporting Israel at every level of the Western governments, from the presidents to the senators to congressmen to even local governments like state governments that have agreements with Israel, fund and support basically grave violations of human rights and international law that amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and even genocide at some levels, like what's happening in Gaza. This hypocrisy calls for action, just like we did South Africa. There's hypocrisy. Governments don't want to act, so people have to act. So the reason we in Palestine, we issued a call in 2005, a civil society call to action, where we pointed this out and said to people around the world, look, fellow human beings, please do something. your governments are not only not doing something, they're actually in cahoots and collusion with these massive violations of human rights and international law. So you, the people, have a responsibility, especially when your money, your tax money, when your weapons are the ones that are doing this violence, that are doing this destruction. So that's why we say philosophically you can act and you should act for your own interest, for your own peace of mind, for your own use of your tax money. Imagine if the billions of dollars that are going to Israel are used in your own cities and towns with dilapidated infrastructure. Israel actually gets, this is maybe an interesting fact for some of you, Israel gets per capita for Israeli Jews, they get more per capita of US taxpayer money than, let's say, Minnesotans get per capita of taxpayer money, federal money I'm talking about.
Thank you for that. And from my own perspective, for speaking as me and not as an MEPN board member, I appreciate how you explain the connectedness of issues, climate change, pandemics, dependence on oil, violence, colonialism. And so I would just like to draw Minnesotans' attention to a couple of issues and opportunities to push for change. So like working for radical change with police violence, fighting oil pipelines that are currently being put in the ground up north, advocating for community-based housing, transitioning to non-fossil fuel energy. So there's so much that we need to do here, in my opinion. So I would challenge, all of you to look how you can be supportive and engaged in those movements, and understanding that, as you so thoroughly pointed out, that it is all connected, and that taking action for a better future here is also taking action for a better future everywhere. So I just like to put that in as well. So another question here is, what inspired you to return to Palestine and begin this important work?
Yeah, I mean, I actually visited Minnesota on the Wheels of Justice bus tour. Those of you who were there almost 17, 18 years ago. And we had this bus that was touring around the states in the US. And we were doing a lot of activism in the US. And I think activism is still needed in the US against war, militarism, etc. Or like what WAM does. I mean, I think it's very important. So I was doing all of this work, and I still think that's important work. But there reached a point in my life where I thought it was more useful for me to direct my energy here. I have already contributed to activism in the US. We started a number of organizations there, etc., including the Palestine Right to Return Coalition and many others. But I thought per unit time that I'm spending, or unit money that I'm spending, I could make more of a difference by being here. Of course, there's more challenge to activism here than in the US, but still, I mean, even in the US, I was harassed by the FBI and others, and profiling as an Arab, as a Palestinian activist. When I was at Yale, especially after September 11th, we were targeted by both Zionists and also the government officials. But it's certainly nothing like the harassment that we get here as Palestinians in our own land. I was arrested here many times, etc. Detained, mistreated, and so on. But I feel that I can achieve more from here and from there at this point in my career. And that's indeed, it was the best decision I made to go back to Palestine in 2008. So past 12, almost 13 years now, we have done a lot of work There is a question here which I'd like to answer in the chat, that's put in the chat. It says there are many strong and outspoken groups composed of Jewish Israelis, and are there, Israelis you work with, are there Jewish Israelis who are sympathetic to the treatment of Palestinians? Absolutely, yes. And, when I was arrested, as I told you, over a dozen times, half the times I was arrested with Israeli citizens, Israeli Jewish citizens, I should say, who are against their government's policies. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate. They're not a majority or anything. They're a small, tiny minority. And I look as to what happened in South Africa, where there were some whites from the privileged society who joined the struggle and even joined the ANC, the African National Congress or the Pan-African Congress, and struggled with the local Black people for freedom, for human rights, etc. I think, even though their numbers are small, they are fairly significant because they also illustrates the mythology that Zionists like to impose on you and on everybody else, which is that somehow this is a tribal conflict, or somehow it's Jews versus Arabs or something like that. No, this is not anything like that, or even Israelis versus Palestinians. It's not true. It is simply that you have an apartheid regime, an apartheid system, and you have people struggling against it, just like South Africa. In South Africa, there were blacks and whites who supported apartheid, and there were, blacks and whites who opposed apartheid. So it is a matter of what you support.
Thank you. So we have a question here. In your speaking tours or speaking appointments, do you sense growing support for a one-state solution, and in what distribution?
Well, I wrote a book in 2004 called Sharing the Land of Canaan, in which I explain, and I write books generally. I have several books. I read them so that I can understand what's going on. And in my investigations, my readings in the 1990s, before I wrote this book, I discovered that this whole idea of a two-state solution is not only a mirage, but it's the biggest fraud in history, It's a fraud to talk about two-state solutions, so to speak. Why? Because colonial, anti-colonial struggles cannot be resolved by dividing the country between colonizers and colonized. Never happened in history and never will happen. And if you read history, you can see what I mean. There are 194 recognized countries in the world. Every single one of them was subject to colonization, every single one of them. Even Britain was colonized by the Romans. Italy, Switzerland, Switzerland even. That's why it has a province in the south that's Italian speaking. There is a history. You can look at all these. It's like in patient diagnosis. I say, let's look at other patients who had this problem. So other patients who, you have to make the right diagnosis first, which is colonization, anti-colonization struggle. Once you agree to that, you look at the outcome with other patients. So what's the outcome of these 194 countries? Well, there is one of three possible scenarios. Scenario number one is the colonizers are kicked out of the country. This happened in Algeria and Libya, for example. Algeria, 1 million French left their homes in Algeria, went to France. I don't say back to France because many of them were 6, 7 generations in Algeria. Some of them have never seen France in their life. Very traumatic and also genocidal because 2.5 million Algerians lost their lives in the struggle. The second scenario is genocide of the natives. This happened in Australia, for example, with the Aborigines. It happened in the US with the colonization of the US, genocide, outright genocide, you know. And those two scenarios are very uncommon, by the way. Very few countries have them. The third scenario, which is the most common scenario, is for the descendants of the colonizers and the descendants of the colonized to live in one country. This happened in all the other countries on earth, more than 160 countries, including most of Europe, Southeast Asia, most of, all of Latin America, if you want, you know, South America, Central America, Caribbean islands, Cuba, Mexico, etc., and also Canada and North America. This is the reality. These are the three scenarios. Now you choose which scenario you prefer, but as a biologist, and based on probability alone, I say that third scenario is the most likely. There has never been in history where there's two countries that are, you know, split the country between colonizers and colonized, because that retains a colonizing program. And if the colonizing program is continued, conflict will continue. So you have to decide which one you want here. And we have, as Palestinians, have always chosen the third option. From the beginning, by the way, from the 19th century, we told these colonizers, look, you want to come and live here? Come and live here. We have no problem. But you cannot say, I want a Jewish state, I want to control your lives, I want to kick you out, I want to ethnically cleanse you, or I want to commit genocide against you. That's simply not acceptable.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat here. It's fairly long, so you may want to take a look at it as well. It's, are you familiar with JICCER? What are your thoughts about cooperation with Jordan? The Jordan-Israel Center for Community Environment and Research, a new center at the Arava Institute, will support the well-being of natural and human systems of the Arava Valley through cross-border community initiatives and research. The center aims to reopen bridges between the southern Jordanian and Israeli communities through research, capacity building, and policy engagement for regional, environmental, and sustainable development.
Well, this is a typical what we call normalization activities. Normalization activities are when Israeli centers try to find partners, so-called in Jordan or in Palestine or in the United Arab Emirates or whatever, to make sure that things look normal, like this, everything is okay, hunky-dory, you know, we don't have to worry about politics, let's just focus on something else. Or let's do collaborative research, let's do collaborative working on the environment. The problem with these programs is it beautifies colonization. It makes it look horrible. It makes it in such a way that it makes it difficult for the natives to present their case to the rest of the world, because the Israelis use these programs to go say, why are you complaining about the Palestinians? Look, we have relationships, we have mutual cooperation, we have this or that. This is attempted in all colonial situations. In South Africa, for example, many South African whites in the rulers' circles and in the South African universities and even said, why are you complaining? We are helping the Black people. We're working with them. We are, you know, and it's this Orientalist attitude that comes from colonization. Edward Said wrote a whole book on the subject if you're interested. And this is the problem. It's a problem that, you know, you do not have normalization until after you end colonization. You don't have normalization that strengthens colonization. And this is what these programs do. Now, this Having said that, this doesn't mean that I, as Palestinians, don't work with Israelis. I work with Israelis. I even told you I get arrested with Israelis. I have no problem working with Israelis, even Israeli institutions like Rabbis for Human Rights, like B'Tselem, like Zochrot, organizations whose primary function is to challenge the apartheid regime, challenge occupation, etc. If academic institutions, on the other hand, the Araba institution, for example, is built on stolen land from the natives of that country, the Bedouins of the Negev. There's a village near the Araba institution that was demolished 183 times. Where is the Araba institution in this? Why don't they say something? Why does the Ben Gurion University, which is the umbrella under which the Araba Institute works, why don't they say something about, or resist, or at least give the land back that Ben Gurion University is built on? Part of it belongs to the Palestinians. Start with yourself, give back this land that you stole from the Palestinians, and then you can talk about normalizing with them. If you're not willing to challenge, if you're just interested in public relations and beautifying colonialism, then I'm sorry, I don't want to have anything to do with these groups.
Thank you for eloquently defining normalization with that. I was wondering, we're trying to educate our members more on what normalization looks like. Would you be able to define what you think normalization is in your own words? And like maybe give an example?
Well, I will put in the chat also, there is a website called bdsmovement.net, which is the website of the Palestinian movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. In there you can read, and there's also the Palestinian academic and cultural boycotts of Israel, which is PACB. You can look it up. They have directions on how to, what it means to be normalizing, what it means to cooperate with Israelis who want to cooperate with us to bring us all together, because eventually we need to come together, Israelis and Palestinians. We have to work together to end this nightmare, which will be, when we end it, it would be good for Israelis and for Palestinians. So we are interested in this. We are interested in collaboration. We're not interested in public relations stunts that try to beautify the system, so to speak, the system of oppression and destruction that's happening on a daily basis. On a daily basis, here they have demolished some houses just yesterday in Al-Aisawiyah. Let me see one of these groups that is normalization groups, Seeds of Peace, or this group, or environment, let them say something about this. If they say something about this, at least I know where they stand. When they try to not say something about it, they're colluding with, as Howard Dean said, you can't be neutral on moving train, then the train is moving. It's called Zionism. The train of apartheid, repression, ethnic cleansing is moving. Every day it's doing destruction. If you don't stand against it, how can you claim you're for peace, for putting people together, whether to work for environment or to work for anything else? So they have to prove their bona fide interest in human rights and international law. At least they should say, we support international law and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which guarantees the rights of refugees to return to their homes and lands from which they were stolen. When I try to speak to Israeli environmental groups, and I try all the time, even when they took that hill I showed you, Jabal Abu Ghneim, that they took, the Israeli government took over, including from my relatives, it was forested area, and they made it into concrete jungle. I wrote to Israeli environmental groups, Israel Nature Societies, etc. I said, say something about this. Okay, this is not political. They are destroying an environment to build an unneeded Jewish-only colony on stolen Palestinian land. Say something about it. They all refused. Not one of them answered my call. Not one, and I have the letters. They don't respond. They don't want to get involved because it's they're part of the system of repression of colonization. They're not really interested in the environment, except if it has to do with their local environment in their backyard. Let them say something about the Israeli industrial settlements that are built on stolen Palestinian land and that dump their toxic waste on the nearby villages. My master's students studied this. Where is the Arava institution about this? Why don't they say something? Industrial settlements built in the West Bank, not built near Jewish communities, are built near Palestinian areas. Dump their toxic waste on us. Say something about that. Once, if they ever do that, I will come and say, come, we'll work together. But until that time, I think of them as PR efforts that they do these normalization activities.
Thank you. And then to follow up on that, so would you say that the normalization, PR efforts, et cetera, can also, that frame of thinking can also be applied to recent agreements between Israel, the UAE, Sudan, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, this is also a charade. I mean, peace agreements, when you make a peace agreement, you make a peace agreement with the country you were at war with. Israel has never been at war with Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates or Bahrain or any of these countries. They are countries like any other country. Okay, Israel wants to normalize relationship with these countries, whether it's Mexico or China or United Arab Emirates or whatever. That's their business. They want to normalize relations with them. But this is not normalization. This is a different ball game. This is a country that is brought under the pressure of the United States, as some of them admitted, like Sudan said, it was the only way they could get the US to lift them from the countries that sponsor terrorism. So, and allow their economy to move. The US, of course, foreign policy is made in Tel Aviv in many areas. So the US foreign policy made in Tel Aviv told the Pompeo and those guys, make these agreements with the United Arab Emirates, for example, against Iran. Why against Iran? Because Iran is still sticking to principles, will not treat Israel as a normal country, as I think no country should treat Israel as a normal country, just like we did with South Africa. It's an apartheid regime, it's a racist, genocidal regime, so it should not be treated as a normal country. Only when they implement human rights, allow refugees to return, for example, end their military occupation, return the natural resources to the local people, then we can talk about, treating Israel as a normal country. So Iran says, no, we won't do that until that happens, and we leave it to the local people decide the future government of Palestine. I mean, what's wrong with that? When you say, as a country, Iran says, let the people decide. The Palestinians and the Israelis, we have no problem. Let the people decide. There are 13 million Palestinians around the world, 7.5 million are refugees or displaced people, and there are 6 million Israeli Jews. 2/3 of them support Zionism, 1/3 are opposed to Zionism. You put them all together, let them decide the nature of the government they want, not force a minority government on them, force a racist apartheid regime on them. So that's all that Iran is saying, and because of that, it has become enemy number one, of course, for Israel, and as such, by extension, enemy number one for the United States. This happened in the past with Iraq, with Syria, with other countries that the US declared war on behalf of the Zionists.
Got kind of a follow-up question to that, well, a set of questions. So someone is wondering if you would talk about the Iran deal in light of Israel's nuclear arsenal, lack of inspections, non-proliferation treaties, and then just speak a little bit to a potential numerical estimate of Israel's nuclear arsenal.
Well, Israel started working on its nuclear arsenal right after the founding of its state in 1949, after it was recognized by the United Nations. It was recognized by the United Nations conditional on implementing UN resolutions, including the right of refugees to return. Israel ignored international law in this, and once, because the world let it off the hook on this, it started immediately to think of other things it can do where it can violate international law with impunity, including the nuclear proliferation weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons. We have to remember they even used some of these weapons that are banned internationally on Palestinians. So Israel feels it can get away literally with murder because of the impunity it faces. And why does it have this impunity? Because they have a strong lobby in Washington and in just about every state of the union, where it pressures politicians to do its bidding, basically. And you know, in the case of South Africa, there was not a white pro-Afrikaner apartheid system around the world or lobby that's working to help the Afrikaner, community in South Africa retain its apartheid regime. So the apartheid in South Africa collapsed eventually. In the case of Israel, this is different. There is a very strong Zionist lobby. One has to respect this lobby. It's really fairly sophisticated, well-funded, penetrated every aspect of American society. And because the US is a global superpower, basically, especially after the decline of the Soviet Union to who was like the other side. Now China is rising, there's hope there, but anyways, now the US was the superpower, the global power, the only power. Who's going to say no to Israel? Kennedy was the only president, actually before him Eisenhower, who's his mentor. Eisenhower stood up to Israel in 1956. Kennedy tried to stand up to Israel on the issue of nuclear weapon power in 1961. And some people say he was assassinated because of this. But anyways, that's what we have. Since Kennedy, there are hardly any US president willing to stand up to Israeli power in the US, which funnels billions of dollars to support these violations. As far as the quantity, nobody knows for sure, but there's some guesses and studies. And Mordechai Vanunu spilled some secrets on Israel's nuclear power. That should have been enough for the world to wake up, but unfortunately no. And he's been held basically for decades in jail in solitary confinement, and he's still now here, refused any chance to travel outside the country. He wants to leave the country. Mordechai Vanunu worked at Dimona, and according to the pictures and that were analyzed by nuclear weapons experts who looked at his picture published in The Guardian, they estimated that then, we're talking about the 1970s, early 80s, that by then Israel had capacity for 200, 300 nuclear weapons. Of course, since then, they worked with South Africa to test some weapons in the South African Ocean areas of South Africa, when South Africa was under apartheid, of course. And some people now estimate that Israel has probably hundreds and hundreds more, including perhaps hydrogen bombs and other things. And now they are expanding. There's a story in Haaretz that shows satellite pictures of Dimona being expanded as a nuclear facility.
Thank you. So to make sure that we're respectful of everyone's time and end on time, there are about 4 more questions left. So we'll go through those and then we'll conclude. So Mazin, would you please comment on the Kairos document of 2005 in regards to one-state solution? Thank you.
Well, I mean, Kairos document is built around similar lines as Kairos document from South Africans who said to churches around the world, you know, if you really believe in Jesus, you cannot be supporting apartheid, you cannot be supporting segregation, you cannot be supporting discrimination, and we expect you to act. So it's along the same lines with the civil society call to action. But in the case of the Kairos, it was directly, you know, towards Christian churches around the world. And especially also challenging as Palestinian Christians. I'm a member of a network of Christian organizations and individuals here. You know, we all support this document. Actually, you know, there are many Christian denominations. It's very hard to get them to agree to one thing. So it's kind of remarkable that every single Christian denomination in Palestine supported this document. Lutherans, Orthodox, Catholics, Protestants, etc. We all supported this document because it's logical and because it is based on what it says in the Bible. Jesus preached like his Sermon on the Mount, that you have to stand with the poor people, with the suffering people, not with the oppressors, not with the powers to be, so to speak, for convenience, for money, for resources, etc. So we all support the Kairos document, and it's been remarkable in its growth and so forth. The last point I make about it is it's also the Kairos document is a very good answer to the so-called misnomer of Christian Zionism. You know, the word Christian Zionism, I think, is an oxymoron. You cannot be a Christian and a Zionist at the same time. You know, in the same way I think of Zionism as not Judaism. I think it's wrong to equate Zionism to Judaism. It's also wrong to say that somebody can be a Christian and a Zionist at the same time.
Thank you. So we have someone wondering, how can we feed everyone in the world if we move to growing foods without artificial inputs?
Say that again. How can we do what?
Yes. How can we feed everyone in the world if we move to growing foods without artificial inputs?
Oh, it's very easy because I know it's doable. We have done it with farmers here, where they have actually permaculture and systems like that produce far more healthy foods, far more organic food. And the net output of permaculture, organic agriculture, ecological agriculture is actually much more than so-called industrialized agriculture, which is not sustainable. When you use pesticides and unnatural fertilizers, the soil is depleted in time. The bugs that are in the soil that keep, you know, the organic content of the soil are killed, and so the soil become more and more sterile year after year. That's why industrialized farms, they are successful the first few years, and then their production starts to plummet, and they have to invest more and more money in like genetically modified organisms or in pesticides, insecticides, fertilizers. It's really economically wrong. I mean, it's beneficial for these companies like Monsanto, etc., that are making billions, but it's certainly economically not very good in terms of production of human food. It's not the way to go. And there's plenty of evidence, many books about this, and lots of data, even from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, that show this. So I think it's a fallacy that they try to feed us, that literally feed us. They try to force it on us that we need to follow their systems of industrialized agriculture.
Thank you. 2 questions left here. When I did my sabbatical at Tantur Ecumenical Center in Israel, many of the Palestinians working with us told me that they had become American citizens. Do you have any insight into why this might be?
Yeah, just one correction. Tantur is not in Israel. Tantur is in Jerusalem, which is Palestine, by international law also. And Israel is in violation of international law by annexing Jerusalem. It does not belong to Israel. Jerusalem is Palestine by the UN Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. But anyway, regarding Palestinians, I wrote, many Palestinians, especially young people, are looking to leave the country. And many of them would love to get another citizenship. Many Israelis also are the same way. 70% of Israelis actually hold foreign passports. The number for Palestinians is less than 10%. So why is that? What is the situation? There's a conflict here. There's an issue here. The issue is very obvious. You know, I think the diagnosis is obvious, as I explained. It's settler colonialism and its impact on people and the environment and well-being of people. Now, I wrote a chapter in a book recently about mental colonization, which affects both Israelis and Palestinians. You know, in South Africa, you know, Stephen Biko once said, the best weapon in the hand of the occupier is the mind of the occupied people. So mental colonization is yet another way, like I was telling you earlier, that the colonization infiltrates every aspect of our lives. It makes it, you know, this is again not unusual in world history. If you remember, during slavery period also, there were house slaves and there were field slaves, and there were many house slaves. In the Nazi era, there were Jews who were participating in persecution of fellow Jews, etc., gypsies and so on. This is mental colonization. It's the internalization of what the oppression makes to your mind. What the oppression intends to make is to change your mind and make you obedient slave or servant or you know, whatever, indentured labor. You know, the wall that Israel has built on Palestinian land that's already destroyed over 1 million trees. This wall was built mostly by Palestinian labor. Sorry to say this, but this is the reality, you know. It's mental colonization. And also people have to eat. They cannot starve, you know, they prefer to eat and then fight another day, so to speak. So we do have a lot of challenges here with this issue, and I hope that you know, more people will awaken to these challenges, read about them, and challenge them.
Thank you. And that goes right into our last question of, can the grassroots efforts have an effect to bring freedom, justice, and equity for the Palestinian people?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think we will get absolute justice. That never happens in a colonial, anti-colonial struggle. Even with that third scenario that I talked about, that never happens. In South Africa, for example, there is still economic apartheid, where the whites still control a lot of the natural resources that they acquired by theft from the local people. But indeed, grassroots efforts is the only thing that can make the world change in a positive direction. If you think in our own country, the US, I'm now speaking, putting the American hat on. As an American, when I look at the history of the US, if you read Howard Zinn's book about the people's history of the United States, what are the positive things that happened in the past 200 years and how did we get them? We got them because of grassroots efforts. Think of the woman right to vote, for example, in the 1920s. Think of Social Security, think of civil rights, ending the war in Vietnam, ending US support for apartheid in South Africa, 40-hour work week, unions, all of these things, all of these positive things that we are all very proud of happened because grassroots mobilized. The same thing here in Palestine. I wrote a book called Popular Resistance in Palestine, subtitled A History of Hope and Empowerment, where I talk, just like I took the model of Howard Zinn about the US people's history, and I wrote a people's history of Palestine. For 120 years, plenty of wonderful achievements. I wouldn't be here actually speaking to you if it wasn't for this grassroots movement. I'd be not born, or I would be in a refugee camp in Syria or Lebanon or Jordan. The popular movements, the grassroots movement, the popular resistance is what allows me to even do this institute, this museum, these facilities, this agriculture. This is all grassroots movement. And the Zionists don't like that. The people in power don't like that, so they fight us. So the same, as I said, all our struggles are connected. So if you want to see good things happen in the US, you need to continue mobilizing and join those three groups, for example, that are hosting this event, WAM and MAPN and Jewish Voice for Peace. They are doing grassroots work. They are doing it because I believe in the output is possible. There is hope. You keep hope alive.
Thank you so much. So we'll just go to Janet for a couple moments.
If I may just add one more thing quickly.
Please do.
I would love to get your email addresses. If those of you who want to be on our email list, we have a weekly message that we send, which gives you actions to do, things that you can do in your own neighborhood, etc., that help this. And so you can email me at info@palestinenature.org, and I can add you to our email list. And also we can continue this conversation if you want.
Excellent, thank you.
Mazin, this is Janet again. I want to personally thank you for that excellent presentation. Every time we do these forums, I know I can say personally, I learned so much, and it also fortifies my my need and my desire to participate in these grassroots movements. I think of the reunification of East and West Germany and how that was truly a grassroots movement as well. So that can be added to the list. I would like to thank all those who participated with questions, with watching and listening. We hope that you learned as much as I did. I'd like to thank our partners once again, Jewish Voice for Peace and Women Against Military Madness. Lucia, thank you for your excellent introduction. Excuse the phone ring, of Mazin. And please stay tuned for information for our next month's forum, which will be March 20th. We will feature Grant Smith, Director of the Institute for Research. Again, our thanks, shukran, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.